For the IT department, we're looking at creating fact and dimension tables. So if we take a look at our input here, we can see that we've got input that is looking at orders with different products in those orders from different customers, from different stores. And basically, we just want to break this down into 3-dimension tables and a fact table. So we've got a couple of bits of cleaning to do before we start that process. So we're taking our order ID here and splitting that out into the store name and the order ID. So just a simple case of going to the ellipsis menu of our order ID and splitting our values. I used an automatic split because it's all in a very similar format and it splits out into the two fields that we require. So then it's just a case of renaming those fields, so order ID and store. Now, if you've just done that step, they'll probably both be over here on the left, the order ID in the store. The reason that mine are in a different place is just because I rearranged them later on in the output steps, and sort of when you reorder the columns in Prep, then reordering them later on, it'll kind of change the order of them earlier on, but that's not really too important. They're still doing the same thing. Okay, next we're going to take a look at this returned state field, and we're going to turn it into a field called returned and just have a 0 or a 1. So for these null values, we're going to replace those with 0, and for the return processed, we'll replace that with a 1. And it's worth mentioning that this is at the product level rather than at the order ID level. So, it might not be that a whole order is returned, just some of the products in that order. So I used an if calculation in order to do that. You could easily have just clicked on the values and replaced them with a 1 or a 0, but I chose to create a whole new field and just do if is null, then give it a 0, else give it a 1, and just remove that original field. Finally, for our sales, we just want to do the unit price times by the quantity. But our issue initially with our unit price is that it has the pound sign at the front of it. Sorry, let me go back to the previous step to show you there that here we have the pound sign at the start of each of the unit prices. So we want to remove that pound sign, make it a number, and then multiply it by the quantity to create our sales field. So I used just a replace function there to get rid of the pound sign, turned it into a number using the float function, and then did the unit price times by the quantity. Okay, and then we're ready to start creating our dimension tables. So for the store, that's definitely the simplest one. We just group by the store there, and we take the minimum order date. So the reasoning we're using the minimum order date each time is that when we're creating an ID, if we were just to rank, say, on the store name, then if we got a store that was, say, opened up in, I'm trying to think of a city that begins with the letter A, and I'm coming up completely blank, but say we did have a city that started with the letter A, we wouldn't want that to suddenly be number 1 and for all the other stores after it to be thrown off. So that's why we bring in the minimum order date, so that even if that store came in beginning with the letter A, we'd be sorting by the order date first, so that store would still go to the bottom and be assigned the number 8 rather than the number 1. So let's just see how we go about doing that. So that, in this case, it means that we have our order date first. That's what we're sorting by or ordering by first in our ranking. And then we have our store name, both of them going in ascending order. And that's how we get our store ID field. Then we just have our separate output here for our dimension table, join it back onto our original data set and make sure that we get rid of all the fields apart from the store ID. So we remove the store from our original data set, and then we don't bring through that first order or store name from this second input here. And then we can look at our customer names next. So we're grouping by our customer name, and we need a couple more fields because we have a couple more things that we want to do with this dimension table. So we're summing up that returned field to find out how many products that customer's returned. We're counting the distinct order IDs so that we know the total number of orders that customer's made. Again, we're taking the minimum order date to work out when their first order was, and then we're counting the distinct product names that they have ordered. Okay, so I was just thinking about the quantity field and how we're not taking that into consideration. But since our return flag isn't based on the quantity either, then this methodology is working for us. Phew, I thought I was going to have to change something. So we're looking at working out that return percentage. So we're just rounding to 2 decimal places the number of returns over the number of products, and then we don't need the returned or the product name, so that's why I didn't bother renaming those fields. We can just remove those fields in the next couple of changes. We can rename our order ID to number of orders, and then we're ready to create our ranking. So very similar again, we just do the order date and the customer name, and that's how we get our customer ID. Again, we go ahead and output this data set, join it on again, very similar way, just making sure we join the customer to the customer, and removing all the fields other than customer ID from our orange input here, and then we can remove the customer name as well, sort of coming from the green input. That's the best way I can think to kind of describe it quickly. Okay, and then we're looking for our product dimension table finally. So again, very similar. This time we're taking the product name, the subcategory, and the category, rather than having sort of separate category or subcategory tables. We're just going to group them all together in the product dimension table. We're also going to bring through the unit price because that doesn't need to be in the initial data set as well. And finally, we just have that minimum order date as well, so that we can, in a very similar way that we've done before, we're going to do that ranking where we have our first sold field and then our product name. If you come across this issue where you can't control whether it's in a ascending or descending sorting mode, then the way to solve that is literally just to drag this and make this window bigger so that then it appears. It's a bit frustrating that that happens. I think it's just because the product name is quite long. But yeah, then you can just hit done and you've got your product ID. Again, we use the output step to create our product dimension table, and we join that product name to product name. For me, this defaulted to doing category to category as the join, and obviously my data exploded to about 50,000 rows. So just be careful that it's joining on the product name, and then only keeping the product ID and getting rid of all the other fields that are sort of duplicated. And then we're ready to do our fact table output, and that is the challenge completed. So hopefully this was a fun sort of different challenge for you, and thanks very much for watching.